there. My name is Dr. Felicia Harris, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for tuning in to the Center for Critical Race Studies Spring 2021 Fellow Spotlight. In contrast to our annual Visiting Scholar in Residence program, our Fellow Spotlight series is a signature event that allows us to showcase the intellect, creativity, and critical insight that our fellows and affiliates bring to their roles as esteemed members of UHD's faculty and staff. Today, we're highlighting the highly anticipated arrival of Dr. Chris Anderson's latest book, Enraged, Rattled, and Wrong, Entitlement's Response to Social Progress. I can tell you right now, without a shadow of a doubt, that you are in for a lively and timely conversation. Our conversation today will be moderated by Dr. Stacy Kraft-DeFreitas, an associate professor of psychology and interim associate dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Dr. DeFreitas' research has appeared in prestigious academic journals, such as Social Psychology of Education and the British Journal of Developmental Psychology. In addition, Dr. DeFreitas is a licensed clinical psychologist and the author of the award-winning textbook, African American Psychology, A Positive Psychology Perspective. Dr. DeFreitas has shared her expertise and passion for academics and mental health in youth of color with the UHD community since joining the faculty in the fall of 2009. This June, she will begin her new role as the Director of Clinical Training for the PVAMU Clinical Psychology Graduate Program. And while we will miss Dr. DeFreitas dearly as she departs for Prairie View, we are grateful that one of her final acts of service to the center was taking the time to be in conversation and shine a light on the brilliant work of our esteemed colleague and CCRS fellow, Dr. Chris Anderson. Now the author of 3 books, Dr. Kristin J. Anderson's previous titles include Modern Misogyny, Anti-Feminism in a Post-Feminist Era, and Benign Bigotry, The Psychology of Subtle Prejudice. In addition to serving as a founding fellow for the Center for Critical Race Studies at UHD, Dr. Anderson is a professor of psychology and highly sought after expert in the areas of psychology and the law, psychology of prejudice, psychology of women, and social psychology. And she serves as a blogger for Psychology Today. Anderson's research explores benign bigotry, subtle forms of prejudice and discrimination, including implicit bias and microaggressions. Since earning a PhD in psychology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, Anderson's scholarship has appeared in prestigious journals such as Sex Roles, Psychology of Women Quarterly, Journal of Language and Social Psychology, and Journal of Latinos in Education. Her latest book, Enraged, Rattled, and Wronged, Entitlement's Response to Social Progress, dives into the many forms and attributes of psychological entitlement. We are so proud of this latest work, and we can't wait to hear more. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Stacy Kraft-DeFreitas and Dr. Kristin J. Anderson in conversation for this year's Fellow Spotlight.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for joining us today. I'm here with Dr. Chris Anderson. I'm Stacy DeFreitas. Let's go ahead and get started, okay? So what inspired you to write Enraged, Rattled, and Wronged?
So I've been studying prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination for a couple of decades now. And we are pretty good at studying discrimination and oppression and looking at the impact on targeted groups. We've gotten really good at studying implicit and explicit bias. In more recent decades, we've become aware of privilege and the power that privilege has, the unearned advantages that dominant group members get for no reason other than their identity. But as I taught and researched these topics, I really saw a kind of piece, like almost a third piece missing, and that piece to me is entitlement. And entitlement is like the sense of deservingness that preferred groups come to possess because of unearned privileges that they have because of their preferred position in society. And so while power and privilege are certainly important and we should continue to study those dynamics, I also became interested in almost the kind of effects of having power and privilege, that sense of entitlement that dominant group members have. And then also, there were just a lot of examples of like entitlement in the media, with, white women calling the police on African Americans sitting in a Starbucks or barbecuing in a park. And there's so much sort of presumptiveness in the entitled that I thought was worth examining more closely.
Right. So you told us a little bit about some of the ways entitlement shows up, right? And also in your book, you say entitlement drives inequality along with power and privilege. So how does entitlement help us to understand inequality?
Well, so I think, I tend to study, rather than the targets of prejudice, those affected by prejudice, I tend to study the prejudiced people, the people who perpetuate prejudice. And so entitlement is really key to understanding people's resistance to social progress, what dominant group members do to resist giving up anything. And sometimes they're not even asked to give up anything. They perceive themselves to be injured in some way or being asked to give up something. But often it's just a perceived sense of entitlement that is being lost. So entitlement to me really explains white resistance, men's resistance to equality, to recognizing others as legitimate, as worthy of humanity. And that goes back, to the founding of this nation. It certainly speaks to Reconstruction and white resentment and, to use Carol Anderson's term, white rage, during Reconstruction. The Tulsa race massacre that we're acknowledging now at its 100th anniversary is explained in part by the sort of entitlement that white people have had, and then the resentment that they have when they see others progressing.
Do you think there's an awareness in those people who are entitled?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I think in a lot of ways there isn't. I mean, one of the kind of thorny aspects of entitlement as well as privilege, this people kind of lose their minds a little bit when you ask them to look at privilege or check their privilege. They don't know what you mean by that. So the thing about being entitled is it happens, slowly over time. You are just a member of a dominant group, a preferred group. So the people you see on TV look like you, the people you read about in books look like you. And so you come to believe that you are normal, that you're ideal, that you're just the kind of main person, the floor model, if you will. And so entitled people don't tend to really consciously see themselves as special or even superior, but it is a way of just sort of making your way through the world that is kind of revealing of that. So that's what makes talking about entitlement, just like talking about privilege, really difficult to talk about, because the people who have it are the last to know. Because one of the things about being entitled is that you don't really know yourself. You don't have an accurate view of your capabilities, your limitations, because you have been told implicitly and sometimes explicitly all your life that you're what's good about the United States. You're the kind of main person, the spotlight should be on you, and you should make your way through the world unimpeded.
So you have a chapter in your book named Entitlement's Cruel Cousins. Tell us about some of these ideas that are related to entitlement.
Yeah, so one of the I think fascinating but also really scary aspects of entitlement, and again, if thinking about entitlement as one's sense of deservingness, and the way psychologists study entitlement is it's an overblown sense of deservingness. That attitude or those sets of attitudes are correlated with a lot of other really unfortunate attitudes and ideologies. So, for instance, people who are entitled, probably not surprising by now, tend to be overconfident. Their confidence does not match their abilities often. They think they deserve a lot more than their actual merit suggests. And it's correlated with arrogance. Entitlement is sort of the enemy of humility and modesty. Entitlement is also correlated with some of the more really kind of negative aspects of narcissism, because entitlement is really somewhat having to do with like self-centeredness, that the world should revolve around me. It's correlated with authoritarianism and right-wing authoritarian ideologies, and that's really important now because we just finished a presidential administration that practiced authoritarian politics and political strategies. And that really resonated with certain voters that tend to have authoritarian styles themselves. And so authoritarians tend to think that the people on top should be there, that people who don't follow rules, they're very law and order oriented, at least about other people, maybe not themselves. Right. And so entitlement is correlated with all kinds of really kind of negative, hostile worldviews. It's associated with anger and kind of hostility toward others. You see, a sense of entitlement in mass shootings, unfortunately, where some people feel entitled to take out their grievances on others, to move outward as opposed to inward. And so, yeah, that's what I try to capture in that chapter called Entitlement's Cruel Cousins.
Yeah. You also, you mentioned meritocracy, right? So is there a connection between entitlement and this belief in meritocracy?
There absolutely is, because so entitled people tend to believe that they got where they are on their own merit. And they also, one of those cruel cousins that I mentioned before is individualism. So entitled people tend to see that they got where they are because of their individual effort or their intelligence or their genius. That's what allowed them to succeed. And that's not usually the case, because there are many people who are smart, many people who work hard. There's only so many hours in a week. And there's many people who work hard. So the entitled tend to say, I got where I got because I worked hard and everybody else doesn't work hard. So they believe in the myth of meritocracy. But for themselves, they also at the same time feel that they should get special treatment. And they don't see it as special treatment because it's what they've come to believe they deserve. So for instance, there's a kind of subcategory of entitlement, which is academic entitlement. And academic entitlement manifests in students who say, well, you should give me a break if I don't show up to class, or you should curve my grade because I feel like I deserve, I was here all semester, I kind of deserve an A or a B, even when they maybe didn't earn it. So the idea of entitlement gets kind of mixed up with individualism and with meritocracy. But again, the meritocracy is really kind of in the abstract. It's for everybody else, and I should get exceptions. I deserve special treatment. I deserve, to have the wind at my back.
Right.
uh,
And not even really acknowledging.
and not realizing it.
Mhm.
Again, that dynamic of entitlement is pretty similar to privilege. It's like, well, I don't get followed around at a record store, not if there are record stores or records anymore, but yeah, I don't get followed by security when I shop. And that feels natural and normal. And it's
Mhm.
not realizing that some people do get followed around, not because they deserve to be followed around, but because of their identity. So again, entitled people are the last to know about their entitlement, and that is really unfortunate because it's like the opposite of self-awareness.
Mm.
Like you don't really realize the extent to which the wind is at your back, the extent to which you have failed upward, as Michelle Obama sometimes speaks about.
So you talked a little bit here about politics, right? And in the book, you talk about how working and middle class whites continue to vote for politicians that aren't really supporting their economic interests. And can you talk about why that might be? And
Yeah, so that's been a question, ever since Trump got elected. All these kind of white working class former coal miners were interviewed, at lunch counters in plaid shirts. And they were kind of a really popular constituency to interview. Um, in fact, Trump voters tended to have higher incomes than Clinton voters, but still there was that curiosity of why a working class person would vote for Trump. And in fact, it was only working class white people who voted for Trump. Working class people of color did not vote for Trump. So the question, of course, is, well, why, when Trump seemed utterly unconcerned with working class issues, and we now have evidence of that because we had 4 years of the total ignoring of working class issues, why would white working class people, especially white working class men, vote for Trump? So they vote against their economic interest, but they vote in favor of their racial interests. And we have to be really honest about that if we're gonna make any progress. The people who voted for Trump tended to see them losing out to a changing America, to immigrants that were flooding the borders, to people of color that were getting jobs that they perceived were their jobs. And so if you ignore economic interests, you can see that many Trump voters voted for Trump, not because he would do a lot for them economically, but he would give them a sense of importance. He would make America great again. And for that, it means putting the white, heterosexual, cisgender man back at the center, back at what's important, and stave off the change that is coming.
okay, so you've told us a little bit about entitlement, its relationship to privilege, but can you give us some examples of what entitlement looks like in daily life?
Right. So there are kind of endless examples of how entitlement manifests. First and foremost, the pandemic, unfortunately, has offered us some examples of entitlement. So the idea that I shouldn't have to abide by rules or even norms of social distancing or wearing a mask. So if a grocery store asks me to wear a mask, I see that not as sort of being part of a community and making people feel more comfortable. But I see it as a violation of my fundamental rights. Even though there are laws in place, you can't run stoplights without there being consequences. Doctors wear masks when they perform surgery. But this sense of feeling indignant for being asked to simply wear a mask around other people, to me, really kind of epitomizes the entitled, that certain people get to decide that social rules or actual rules simply don't apply to them. Another example of entitlement is the college cheating scandal. If you remember that from a couple years ago, the varsity blues scandal, as it was called, where wealthy parents felt entitled to have their kids go to the best schools, and their kids apparently couldn't get in these schools on their own merit. Even though some of these people are champions of meritocracy, but for them, not so much. And so the idea that one could just pay an athletic director to Photoshop their child playing soccer when they've never kicked a ball kind of epitomizes entitlement. One of my more favorite examples, just because it's so egregious, is the kind of white person calling the police on not even African Americans doing something illegal, but just doing something that the white person doesn't like, or being suspicious of them for no apparent reason. So, an African American man who's trying to get into his own apartment building is interrogated by another, resident who questions his existence in being there. Or a young Black girl, 9 years old, was selling water in front of her stoop, in front of her house, to passersby, and the police were called on her. Whereas, little white girls and boys have been selling lemonade for decades. So the kind of calling, using the police as your own sort of racial valet, to me is something else that epitomizes entitlement. So just the idea that a company saying Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas could upset someone so much that they feel that their religion, the most dominant religion in the United States, is being undermined, or there's a war on Christmas because someone says Happy Holidays. Someone who is trying to be more inclusive, and the interpretation of it is to feel sidelined, to feel rattled by being feeling dismissed, even when they're not dismissed. So those are some kind of recent examples of entitlement.
Thank you for that. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about climate change and sustainability, which you also mentioned, in terms of how entitlement explains why the U.S. is so far behind in addressing these issues. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, the United States has done a lot less than other comparable nations with regard to climate change. And this really epitomizes entitlement, because the main point I want to make in this book about entitlement is entitled people, or really even entitled political strategies, refuse to adapt. They do not want to change. Change is scary, is threatening, it makes them mad. And so if you put people in charge of legislation who feel entitled to have a world that they grew up with, that they're used to, they will see no point and in addressing climate change. They don't want to adapt. They are incapable of adapting because they haven't really been asked to adapt. And this is why you have such a small group of people who might be former factory workers, who used to make $30 an hour, and those jobs don't exist anymore, or coal miners that used to be able to feed their families on a living wage. Those jobs don't exist anymore. Some people have adapted to that, but some people haven't, and it tends to be the entitled. And so the United States, unfortunately, is in a really bad position to address climate change because of the resistance to change. The kind of lack of motivation to really adapt to what is happening, in front of us.
So when you think about your book and what people can learn from it, what group of people do you want to read it the most?
So I would love, everybody to read the book, of course. We talked earlier about how those who are most entitled are sort of the least likely to see it in themselves. So I don't know if the book will reach some people, but I like to think that the book at least offers a framework to people who kind of already know these things, but maybe there's some language in the book. There's a way of thinking about it, a structure that can be helpful to them. So I hope, students will read it, and I hope to, use it in some of my classes. I hope activists will read it, people interested in politics, to understand that a component to studying these issues, a component to change and to social progress has to be that kind of overblown sense of deservingness that a lot of people have, because it's so key to understanding why we've really stalled. And in some cases, we've really gone backwards, in the last 30 or 40 years. So I hope, I hope, of course, everybody reads it, but especially the people that are kind of already a little bit thinking about these topics. I hope it's especially useful to them.
Yeah. Well, it may be a good gift for anybody who is entitled.
Yes.
And so if you know someone who's entitled
Great idea.
and you would like to make a gift, enraged, rattled, and wronged is a good option.
That's a great idea.
And how do we reduce this sense of entitlement in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. I'm a psychologist, as you are, and so we tend to study individuals, but we know that individuals operate in systems with institutional support. And so I think we need legislation that really counters this idea of kind of individual merit, that I've gotten where I've gotten because I've worked hard and everybody else they're slackers, they're lazy, they're mooching off the government. And so I think we have to kind of train ourselves to not think that we are exceptional, to not think that the United States is exceptional. The United States has great qualities. We still have a lot of work to do, but the notion of American exceptionalism really, is closely linked to entitlement. We shouldn't have to change. We shouldn't have to adapt. And so I think we could use a little more humility on the kind of psychological level, on the interpersonal level, and also on the legislative level.
Okay. Thank you for that. So what's your next writing project? What are you working on next?
Yeah, so I'm not sure it's going to be, in the area of prejudice and discrimination and stereotyping. This is my third book kind of on that topic broadly. So it'll be something in that area. I don't quite know yet. So I'm open to ideas.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else you'd like our viewers to know?
Yeah, I don't think so. I appreciate the questions you asked me, and I appreciate being able to come and talk about this work I've been doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. And thank you so much for watching.